It was just another night in a hotel room, the kind where you think you're safe, tucked away from the chaos of the world outside. But for one black woman, that night turned into a nightmare that she never saw coming. Imagine the shock, the disbelief, and the fear that would rush through you as you hear the pounding on the door, the sound of voices yelling commands you don't understand. And then, without warning, the door bursts open. But this wasn't some random break-in. These were cops, racist cops, storming into her room, uninvited, unprovoked, and with nothing but prejudice on their minds. What happened next was nothing short of a reckoning, a situation where the officers' assumptions were about to meet something they could never have expected. This isn't just another story about police misconduct. It's a story about power, about assumptions, and about what happens when those assumptions are shattered. What they didn't know about the woman in that hotel room, what they didn't realize, is what makes this story so gripping. It's the kind of situation where the tables are turned in ways that are almost unimaginable, and the truth about who is really in control begins to unfold. And as these cops try to impose their will, they had no idea who they were really dealing with. What they saw as a simple target turned out to be much more than they bargained for. Now, you might be wondering, what could possibly happen when someone who's been unfairly targeted is pushed too far? How does a woman, alone in a hotel room, deal with the weight of systemic racism, especially when it comes from those who are supposed to protect? The tension was palpable, the anger palpable. But in the midst of all of this, something happened, something unexpected, something that left the officers dumbfounded. And it all unfolded in that one defining moment that left us all questioning. What happens when the system meets its match? But before we dive deeper into the twists and turns of this incredible story, think about this. What happens when you finally find the courage to fight back against the system? What happens when the victim has more power than anyone ever expected? Stay tuned, because what's about to unfold will change the way you look at the world and at the systems that are supposed to protect us all. The truth is coming, and it's not the one they thought they knew. The night had started like any other. The woman had checked into the hotel earlier that evening after a long day of travel. She was exhausted, just wanting to rest. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was clean, with decent amenities, and she knew it would be a safe spot for the night. She had been in and out of hotels for years, always staying on the move for work, for family, for reasons that required a sense of temporary home in every new place she went. But that night, there was something in the air, a tension she couldn't quite shake off. She brushed it aside, telling herself it was just the fatigue, the familiar traveler's anxiety that always crept up before a night's sleep. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that a small, seemingly insignificant detail had already set things in motion. A misunderstanding, fueled by assumptions, was already brewing in the background. The cops had been called to the scene, though no one was entirely sure why at first. But once they saw her, once they saw a black woman alone in the hotel room, something clicked in their minds. The stereotypes, the prejudices, the narratives that had been ingrained in them from their surroundings began to rise to the surface. They saw what they wanted to see, not what was really there, and they acted on that bias. It was all too familiar, all too predictable, until it wasn't. Because the woman they were about to confront was not the person they thought she was. Her story was different, her background more complicated than they could have imagined, and her reaction to their intrusion would leave them reeling. The officers stormed in with a sense of authority, convinced they were in control, convinced they knew everything they needed to know. But as they looked at the woman standing before them, her calmness and composure unnerved them. The officers were prepared for defiance, ready for a confrontation they assumed would be violent. But instead, they were met with something far more disorienting. There was no frantic reaction, no yelling or screaming. Instead, the woman stood there, her eyes steady, her posture unwavering. It was almost as if she wasn't fazed by their presence at all, as if she had seen this play out before, but with a subtle difference. The calmness in her demeanor wasn't out of submission, it wasn't fear. It was the kind of confidence that only came from knowing something they didn't. They didn't know who she was, not in the way that mattered. They assumed they did. They thought they knew what she represented, what her presence there meant. But they didn't understand the depth of who she was and what she was capable of. They didn't know that this wasn't just a random woman they had walked into. This wasn't a person they could intimidate or control with their standard tactics. In that room, there was more than met the eye. They had miscalculated, and the weight of that mistake was beginning to settle in. But the officers didn't realize it yet. They continued to bark orders, their voices sharp with impatience, trying to get her to comply with their demands. Each word they spoke felt like a hammer striking against the stillness of the room. And yet, with every command, every demand, the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at them with something close to pity, something that made them second-guess their assumptions. They weren't the ones in control, despite what they thought. Still, they pressed on, trying to get the upper hand, trying to force her into a corner. They were so sure they could dominate the situation, so sure their badges and authority would make her bend. But she didn't. The longer the standoff continued, the more they began to realize something was off. This wasn't a typical interaction, and they weren't in charge like they thought. She wasn't responding like most people would, like they expected her to. And the longer this went on, the more uneasy they became, their certainty faltering, their power slipping from their grasp. The woman, meanwhile, hadn't said a word that would have tipped them off to her identity, hadn't given them anything that could lead them to understand the full scope of who she was. She simply let them talk, let them try to assert control over her, all the while maintaining that steady, unnerving calmness. But inside, she knew the truth. Inside, she was preparing to turn the tables, to reveal what they had gotten wrong, to show them who they were truly up against. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this wasn't her first time in situations like this. She had faced this kind of discrimination before, had faced systems that treated her like she didn't belong, like her voice didn't matter. But in her years of experience, she had learned something most people didn't understand. Power isn't always loud. It's not always about what's visible on the surface. Sometimes, the quietest moments, the calmest reactions can be the most powerful. As the officers continued their push, their demands growing more aggressive, the woman knew it was time. It was time to show them that their assumptions were wrong, to make them realize that they had just messed with the wrong person. But she knew she had to wait for the right moment, to bide her time and allow the situation to unfold just enough for her to make her move. In the heat of their attempts to control the situation, they didn't notice her hand slipping into her bag, didn't notice the subtle shift in her posture as she prepared for what was coming next. They didn't realize that the woman they were so sure they could overpower had a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely on force, one that didn't require shouting or physical confrontation. This was the kind of power that came from knowing your worth, knowing your rights, and knowing how to use the system against itself. But before she could reveal her hand, before she could take the next step, the tension in the room reached a boiling point. The officers were getting frustrated now, their patience wearing thin. They couldn't understand why she wasn't reacting the way they expected her to. What was this woman hiding? What was she planning? It was as if they were in the presence of someone who had seen through their act, someone who had already won the battle they didn't even know they were fighting. And that realization, that subtle shift in the air, left them with a sinking feeling in their stomachs, a feeling they couldn't quite shake. As the minutes dragged on, the feeling of uncertainty only deepened. The question that loomed over everything was clear. How long could they keep this up before the woman finally decided to stop playing by their rules? And when she did, what would they do then? The tension in the hotel room felt like it could snap at any moment. The air was thick with unease, a kind of quiet before the storm. The officers, still unsure of what they were dealing with, exchanged looks of frustration. They had come in with one goal in mind, to assert their authority and restore the status quo. But this woman, this calm, composed figure standing before them, was doing something they hadn't anticipated. She wasn't playing by the rules they knew. She wasn't reacting how they expected her to. Their minds raced, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. They had come in thinking this would be a quick and easy job, but now there was something unsettling about the way she moved, the way she held herself. It was as if she knew exactly how to handle them, how to play this game. She wasn't intimidated, and that was the most dangerous thing they could face. One officer, a man with a hardened demeanor, stepped forward, his hand resting on the side of his gun. It was a subtle movement, but one that showed his readiness to escalate things. He was the type who believed in showing force, believing that fear was the quickest way to regain control. His fingers twitched at the holster, but he kept his gaze locked on her, trying to read her, trying to figure out what made her tick. But the woman didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge the officer's subtle threat. Instead, her gaze stayed steady, piercing through the tension in the room. It was as if she was seeing through them, looking beyond their badges and uniforms to the men behind the badges, and that, more than anything, unsettled them. They were used to intimidating people, used to commanding respect just by showing up with their uniforms and guns. But this woman wasn't like everyone else. She wasn't afraid, and that fearlessness made them question everything they thought they knew. She knew what they were thinking. She knew they saw her as a target, someone to be controlled, to be pushed down. She had seen it before, the judgment in their eyes, the assumptions based on her appearance, based on the color of her skin. It wasn't the first time she had been treated this way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But what they didn't realize was that she had also learned how to navigate the system, how to work within it, how to fight back without ever raising a fist. The woman wasn't just any regular person. Her life had been shaped by years of navigating this world that often tried to keep her in a box. She had fought for every step she had made, every moment of peace she had earned. But now she wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for something bigger. She knew that the outcome of this encounter wouldn't just affect her. It would ripple out, sending a message. And that message had to be loud enough for the officers to hear it, loud enough for the world to understand. But what could she do? How could she turn the tables in a way that didn't rely on the same force the officers expected her to use? She wasn't about to start shouting, wasn't about to get into a physical confrontation. That was exactly what they wanted, exactly what they were prepared for. No, this wasn't about fighting fire with fire. It was about using their own weight against them. It was about being smarter, not stronger. Meanwhile, the officers were growing increasingly frustrated. One of them, a younger officer, had started to pace back and forth, his boots tapping against the carpet in quick succession. His nervous energy was palpable. He couldn't understand it. Why wasn't she reacting? Why wasn't she scared? The longer this went on, the more he began to doubt his training, his instincts. They had always been told to assert their dominance, to show strength in situations like this. But this was different. This wasn't just some random situation. This was a woman who wasn't breaking under pressure. It was as if she had seen the worst of the world and come out stronger on the other side. The older officer, the one who had tried to assert dominance earlier, seemed to sense the shift. He had been watching his younger colleague, who was now visibly rattled, unsure of what to do. This wasn't the way things were supposed to go. He needed to regain control. He needed to finish this and move on. And yet, as he stood there, his mind raced through the possibilities. What was she waiting for? What was her next move? But the woman wasn't waiting. She was calculating. Every moment was part of the plan she had been quietly building in her mind. Every glance, every word, every second of silence was a piece of the puzzle. She wasn't going to let them control the narrative. This was her moment, and she was going to make it count. Her silence, the way she didn't give them the reaction they craved, started to eat away at their resolve. They couldn't understand it, couldn't figure out what to do with someone who wouldn't submit, someone who wouldn't crumble under their pressure. It was making them look weaker with every passing second. Then the woman did something unexpected. Without a word, she reached for her phone and placed it on the small table by the bed, facing up so that the officers could see it. For a moment, the officers froze. They hadn't expected that. They were used to the usual tactics, the defensive body language, the refusal to comply, the yelling. But this was different. What was she doing? The younger officer's eyes darted to the phone, and his suspicion grew. The woman hadn't said a word, hadn't made any direct move, but the mere presence of the phone on the table sent a signal. She wasn't afraid to be recorded. She wasn't afraid of the consequences of being seen. The older officer took a step forward, trying to regain control of the situation. But now there was something else in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The phone was just a tool. But the act of placing it there, that was a challenge. What the officers didn't know, what they hadn't anticipated, was that she was not just recording this moment for herself. This wasn't about documenting a confrontation. This was about making sure the world would see this. If they thought they could get away with it, if they thought they could intimidate and bully, they were about to be proven wrong. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in with each passing second. The officers, still unsure of their footing, began to sense the shift in the air, a tension thick enough to cut through. They exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shaken, but still holding on to the belief that they were in control. The younger officer's hand hovered near his belt, where his taser was clipped. His fingers twitched nervously, but he wasn't sure if he should make a move. The older officer's eyes, however, were locked onto the phone on the table. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what was going on. Why had she placed it there? What was she hoping to do? The woman could feel the change, the subtle shift in their energy. She had their attention now. The phone, sitting there so innocently, had become the epicenter of the room. She knew it would be the game changer. The officers, still trying to maintain their dominance, were starting to question themselves. Their training had never accounted for something like this. The silence between them stretched on, heavy with unspoken words. She watched them, her eyes never leaving their faces. She wasn't in a rush. The longer they stood there, unsure and waiting for her to make a move, the more they would doubt themselves. Every second that ticked by was a victory. It was as if she had already won the battle, and they were just too blind to see it. Her phone wasn't just a recording device, it was a lifeline. She had it ready for a reason. The officers didn't realize yet, but that phone was about to change everything. It wasn't just about documenting what was happening. It was about control. About ensuring that if things escalated, there would be a record, proof that she wasn't the one out of line. The officers, meanwhile, hadn't thought of that. They were still focused on trying to get her to comply, to fit into the box they had prepared for her. But she didn't fit, and that made them uncomfortable. The younger officer's voice broke the silence, his words sharp and filled with tension. "What's the phone for?" he asked, his voice trying to sound authoritative, though there was an unmistakable edge of uncertainty in it. The woman didn't answer right away. She simply stared at him, her gaze unwavering. The silence stretched between them, a quiet battle of wills. The longer she held his gaze, the more it seemed to unnerve him. His eyes darted to the older officer, as if looking for reassurance, but the man didn't look back. He was too busy watching her, too caught up in trying to understand what was happening. The younger officer's hand twitched again, but this time it wasn't near his taser. His fingers were hovering just above his radio, a subtle sign that he was ready to call for backup. But as his thumb hovered over the button, something in his gut told him not to do it. He wasn't sure why. He had called for backup before, without hesitation. But something felt off about this situation. Something was different. The older officer, still watching the woman, finally spoke. "Don't touch the phone," he ordered, his voice a low growl. "We don't need any more trouble than we already have." But there was something in his tone that suggested he was more concerned than he let on. He was no longer certain of his own authority. He was no longer sure that the power dynamics were still in place. The woman standing there so calmly was making him question everything he thought he knew. She didn't speak, didn't move, but her presence was enough to challenge everything they thought was under control. Every move they made seemed to make them less certain, less confident. The younger officer shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking between the woman and the door, as if considering his next step. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had been trained to handle confrontations, but this wasn't a typical situation. This wasn't the kind of challenge that could be solved with force. The older officer, sensing his partner's hesitation, took a step closer to the woman, his posture stiffening. "You need to cooperate," he said, his voice forceful now, trying to reclaim control. "This is your last chance. We don't want to escalate this any further." The woman's lips parted just slightly, but her eyes remained locked on his. There was no fear, no anger, just a calm certainty that sent a shiver down his spine. The tension was palpable. The officers, once so sure of themselves, now felt the weight of their own uncertainty pressing in on them. And then, without warning, the younger officer moved, almost as if on instinct. He reached for his radio, his hand trembling slightly, but before he could press the button, the woman spoke, her voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "Go ahead," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Call for backup. But just know this, you're being recorded. Everything you do from this point on will be on video. And if you think I'm the problem here, then you'll see just how far I'll go to make sure the truth comes out." The words hung in the air, heavy with their implication. The younger officer froze, his hand still hovering over the radio. The weight of her statement was like a wall crashing down on him, blocking his every move. He looked to his partner, but the older officer's face was tight with frustration and something else, fear. For the first time since they had entered the room, they weren't in control. The woman had shifted the power dynamic, and now they were the ones on the defensive. Her words had landed, and the idea of being exposed, of their actions being watched and judged, was something they couldn't ignore. The younger officer's gaze flicked back to the phone on the table. It was as though it had become a ticking time bomb, each second that passed bringing them closer to a point of no return. They had already crossed a line, but the question remained. How far would they push it before the situation became unmanageable? Would they back off, or would they continue down a path that was quickly spiraling out of their control? The older officer's hand tightened around his baton, his knuckles white with the strain. The power struggle was building, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Neither side was willing to back down. The game had changed, and now the stakes had never been higher. What would happen next? Would the officers escalate things further, or would the woman's calm confidence be enough to make them rethink their approach? The room was a powder keg, and every moment that passed only made the countdown to something inevitable feel more real. The tension in the room was unbearable, thickening with every passing second as the officers stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The woman's words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge, and the officers, for the first time in their careers, were caught off guard. The silence was so heavy it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. The younger officer's hand hovered over the radio, but it wasn't just his nerves now. Something deeper had taken hold of him. He glanced again at the woman, his mind racing, heart pounding. She was still staring at him, unwavering, calm in her eyes like a mirror reflecting his own hesitation. Her words weren't just a warning, they were a promise. A promise that the truth would come out, no matter what. And as much as he wanted to believe it wasn't that serious, something inside him began to doubt. Something about her, about the whole situation, felt far bigger than either of them could have anticipated. The older officer, trying to mask his own uncertainty, stepped forward again, his voice low but sharp. "You don't know what you're dealing with here," he growled, trying to regain some control, some semblance of authority. "This is bigger than you. This is bigger than your phone." But just as he spoke those words, something unexpected happened. The woman, who had been completely still up until now, took a deliberate step toward him, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. The officers tensed, instinctively preparing for any sudden movement, but she didn't lunge. She simply stopped a mere foot away from him, close enough that he could feel the shift in the air between them. With a cold calmness, she spoke again, this time her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You think I'm the one who doesn't know what I'm dealing with. You have no idea who you're standing in front of." Her words were more than just defiance. They were a spark in a powder keg. The officers flinched, their expressions momentarily flickering with doubt. This wasn't just a random encounter with a woman who wasn't afraid of them. There was something deeper beneath the surface, something they weren't prepared for. And just when it seemed like the moment would hang suspended in the air, a new sound shattered the tension. The faint buzz of a phone vibrating. It came from the woman's pocket, soft at first, but then growing louder, more insistent. The officers turned toward the sound instinctively, their attention split between the phone and the woman in front of them. The woman reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and answered it with a single smooth motion. She didn't look at the officers. She didn't need to. The phone's vibrations had seemed like a distraction, a brief moment of interruption. But the moment she picked up, everything in the room seemed to freeze again. "Hello," she said, her tone calm, almost casual, as if the situation she was in wasn't one of life and death. The younger officer's eyes widened, and the older officer's face twisted in confusion. What was going on? Who could she possibly be talking to? What was happening in this room that they couldn't understand? The air in the room shifted once again, the tension thickening even more, but now there was a new fear in the officer's eyes. The woman's gaze flicked to the officers briefly, as if aware of the doubt creeping into their minds. "I'm fine," she said into the phone, her voice steady, controlled. "I'm exactly where I need to be." But then she said something that made their blood run cold. "They've made their move." The words sent a chill down both officers' spines. The younger one, unable to mask his confusion, took a step back. "What the hell does that mean?" he muttered, barely able to keep his voice from cracking. He had no idea who she was talking to, but the certainty in her words, the fact that she wasn't even remotely flustered, it felt like she knew something they didn't. The woman continued, her voice still low, but carrying an edge that made both officers listen more intently. "You think you've got this figured out, but you don't. There's always someone watching." The older officer narrowed his eyes, his instincts telling him something was terribly wrong. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, his voice sharp now. His patience was wearing thin. This wasn't just a routine encounter anymore. The layers of what was happening were becoming increasingly complex. Who was she really? What was going on here? The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath, almost as if savoring the moment. She finally hung up the phone and put it back in her pocket. The officers were no longer the ones in control. They had walked into a web, and now they were caught, every movement they made feeding into the trap. The silence in the room stretched again, but this time it was heavier than before. The younger officer's hands clenched into fists, his mind a blur of questions, his gut tightening with anxiety. Who was she talking to? What had she meant by someone's watching? Was she really this much of a threat, or was this some twisted game she was playing with them? But it was the older officer's expression that betrayed him. His eyes flicked nervously to the door. That was when the younger officer realized something had changed. The old man wasn't just angry, he was scared. Before the younger officer could ask anything, the woman spoke again, her voice suddenly sharp and commanding. "You're not going to make it out of here the way you think you will." The words hit like a bombshell. The younger officer froze, and for the first time, he truly understood the gravity of the situation. Something was happening here, something bigger than what they had anticipated. The woman, her calm demeanor still unnerving, wasn't just a victim of their assumptions. She was playing a much deeper game, one they hadn't even begun to comprehend. As the woman's words lingered in the air, a noise suddenly echoed from down the hall, footsteps, heavy and deliberate. The younger officer's eyes snapped to the door, and the older officer's face went ashen. Something was happening, something that had shifted the ground beneath their feet. This was no longer just about two cops trying to assert their dominance over a woman. There was something else at play now, something neither of them could control. The clock was ticking. The woman had already played her cards, and now they were left with nothing but the looming unknown. Who was coming? And what was going to happen next? The footsteps grew louder, echoing down the hallway like a distant drumbeat, each step adding weight to the moment. The younger officer's heart raced as he instinctively moved toward the door, his body stiff with fear and uncertainty. The older officer, however, stood frozen, his eyes wide with recognition. There was no mistaking the significance of those footsteps. The door handle rattled slightly, and then it opened with a heavy creak. The officers turned, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. A third figure entered the room, tall, imposing, and dressed in an impeccable suit. He had the presence of someone used to control, to power. His face was calm, but there was a steely glint in his eyes. He surveyed the room with a sense of quiet authority, his gaze falling on the woman who had, until that point, been the focus of all the tension. The woman's lips curled into a small, knowing smile as she met his gaze. "Took you long enough," she said softly. The officers exchanged a confused glance. They had no idea who this man was, but the way the woman spoke to him, like they were old friends, left them in a state of complete disarray. Who was he? And what did he have to do with any of this? The man stepped into the room fully, closing the door behind him. He didn't need to say anything to make his presence felt. The officers instinctively took a step back, their bravado crumbling as they realized they were no longer in charge of the situation. "You've made quite a mess," the man finally said, his voice smooth, but carrying an undeniable authority. His eyes lingered on the two officers, and they immediately felt a sense of dread. It was as if he had already seen everything they had done, every mistake, every misstep, and now they were trapped, exposed. The older officer's mouth went dry. He was still trying to piece together what was going on, but the room felt like it was closing in on him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The man's gaze shifted to the woman, a small, almost imperceptible nod passing between them. "That's the question, isn't it?" he said. "Who am I? Who are you?" The younger officer, still visibly shaken, stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio. But before he could reach it, the man's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Don't even think about it," he warned, his tone colder than anything the officers had encountered. The words hit them with a finality that made them hesitate. They could feel the shift in the room. The power had changed hands, and now they were the ones out of control. The woman's eyes never left the officers, her calm demeanor belying the chaos that was unfolding. She wasn't scared. She wasn't worried. She was exactly where she needed to be, and she had known all along what would happen next. "Everything you thought you knew," she said, her voice steady and unwavering, "was a lie." The officer's confusion deepened, and the older one took a step forward, his frustration bubbling over. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "What is going on here?" The man in the suit raised his hand, silencing him. "Enough," he said. "You want answers? Fine, but you're not in a position to ask questions." He turned back to the woman, his expression softening for a moment. "You were right to make your move. They didn't know who they were dealing with, but I think they've learned their lesson now." The officers stood in stunned silence, the weight of the situation finally beginning to sink in. They hadn't just raided the wrong hotel room, they had stepped into a situation far beyond their comprehension. They had targeted the wrong person, and now they were facing the consequences. The younger officer's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. What was she talking about? What had they really done here? He glanced at the older officer, whose face was ashen, eyes wide with realization. And then it hit them. The woman wasn't just an ordinary person. She wasn't just a victim of their unjustified actions. She was someone with power, someone who had control over the situation from the very beginning. The man in the suit turned back to the officers, his voice now low and menacing. "You've crossed a line," he said, "and there's no going back now. You don't get to walk away from this." The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with impending consequences. The officers stood frozen, their worst fears coming to life. They had been outsmarted, outplayed, and now they were on the verge of paying for their mistakes. Just as they thought they couldn't take any more of the weight pressing down on them, the woman spoke once more, her voice carrying a note of finality. "Your choices have consequences," she said softly, And now you'll learn what happens when you target the wrong people. And then, without warning, the man in the suit pulled out a small, sleek device from his pocket and pressed a button. The lights in the room flickered for a moment before going completely dark. For a split second, the officers felt a wave of panic wash over them. The sudden darkness was disorienting. Their eyes darted around the room, unable to see anything, unable to trust anything they had once believed in. But then, just as quickly as the lights had gone out, they flickered back on. And when they did, the woman was gone. The officers stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. The room was empty now, silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The man in the suit, who had been standing beside the door, was now gone as well. The officers exchanged a panicked glance, their hearts pounding in their chests. What had just transpired? Had it all been a game? A setup? They were left standing in the aftermath, bewildered, and as the minutes ticked by, the weight of their mistakes began to settle in. They had been played, and not by just anyone. The woman they had thought to be a target was someone far more dangerous than they had ever realized. And as they slowly backed toward the door, uncertain of what they had just witnessed, the realization struck them both. The real danger wasn't just in the room, it was everywhere. They had made a powerful enemy, and they had no idea how deep this went. In the silence that followed, only one thought lingered in their minds. They had no idea who they had really been dealing with. The officers stood in the dimly lit hotel room, their breaths shallow and quick. The room, once thick with tension, now felt eerily silent, as though the world itself had stopped moving. The woman was gone, the man in the suit too. The door was locked, and the lights had returned to their usual brightness, as though nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The weight of the moment hung heavily on their shoulders, leaving them with more questions than answers. The younger officer reached out with trembling hands to grab his radio, but when he flipped it on, there was only static. He tried again, but the same blank, lifeless buzz greeted him. His heart pounded as he realized that something wasn't just wrong. It was deliberate. They had been cut off from the outside world. The woman hadn't just vanished, she had orchestrated it. They had no way of contacting backup, no way of making sense of what they had just witnessed. They were isolated. The older officer, still pale, stood with his back pressed against the wall, his hands clenched into fists. His mind raced, replaying the events that had led them here. How had it all gone so wrong? What was the significance of the phone call? The dark figure who had entered the room? And why had she said they didn't know who they were dealing with? What had she meant by that? His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Both officers stiffened, instinctively reaching for their weapons, their nerves on edge. They had learned their lesson the hard way, that nothing in this situation was what it seemed. The younger officer cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. His breath caught in his throat. Standing outside was a man in a simple black suit, holding an envelope. No insignia, no police badge. Just a man with an air of quiet authority. With a glance at the older officer, the younger one slowly opened the door. The man stepped inside without hesitation, his presence commanding the room immediately. He was tall, his posture straight, his eyes sharp. He didn't speak at first, but handed the younger officer the envelope without a word. The officer took it, though he had no idea what to expect. His hands shook as he tore open the seal and unfolded the paper inside. It was a short note, written in neat, precise handwriting. As he read the words aloud, the room fell into a deep silence. "It's not over," he read. "You've only seen the tip of the iceberg. You've made a powerful enemy. There are forces at work here far beyond your understanding. This was only a warning." The words echoed in his mind as the meaning sank in. They weren't just dealing with a woman who had been wrongly targeted. No, this was something far bigger. The consequences of their actions were unfolding in real time, and they had just been handed a piece of a puzzle that was far too complex for them to solve on their own. The older officer's voice was barely above a whisper. Who is she? What does this mean? What happens now? The man in the black suit didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked them both over, as if weighing the seriousness of their predicament. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but laced with an unsettling finality. You'll never know her full story, and that's the way it needs to be. What you do know is this. The system you trust, the one you've relied on your entire career, is not what you think it is. The truth is much darker than you realize. The officers exchanged a glance. There was a sense of finality in the man's words, and yet the fear of the unknown gripped them even tighter. How deep did this go? Who were they really dealing with? You won't be punished, the man continued, but you will be watched. And you'll never forget this day. This was just the beginning. If you try to cross this path again, the consequences won't be so easy to walk away from. With those chilling words, the man turned to leave. But before he exited, he gave them one last piece of advice. Understand this. The only way out is to never come back. Forget what happened here, and keep your distance from the forces you've encountered. Your lives will be safer that way. And with that, the man was gone, leaving the two officers alone in the room once more. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving them in the oppressive silence. The weight of his words hung in the air like a fog they couldn't escape. Neither officer spoke for several long moments. They didn't know what to say, what to think, or what to do next. They had entered this hotel room believing they were in control of the situation, but now they realized how little they truly understood. The system they had worked within, the rules they had followed, were not the same ones that governed this new world. They had crossed a line, one that had forever altered the course of their lives. Eventually, the younger officer spoke, his voice barely audible. What now? The older officer didn't immediately respond. He stared blankly at the closed door, as though trying to understand something that was just beyond his grasp. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with a mixture of regret and resignation. Now we walk away. We forget everything. We do exactly what they told us to do. And we hope that whatever this was, whatever it is, it never finds us again. The words hung in the air, a painful acknowledgement of the reality they now faced. They had been given a chance to walk away, an opportunity to escape the consequences of their actions. But they couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how far they ran, they would always carry the weight of this day with them. As they left the hotel room behind, neither officer could shake the lingering feeling that they had stepped into something far beyond their comprehension. They didn't know who the woman was, or who the man in the suit represented, but they knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of something much larger. And no matter how hard they tried to forget, the shadow of this encounter would follow them for the rest of their lives. The truth, as it turned out, was far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined.